Up to this point, we've talked about shareholder theory versus stakeholder theory. We've also discussed elements of moral responsibility and the mitigation of moral responsibility. Now we look at obstacles to moral behavior that arise in real-life situations. First, we'll talk about 4 steps involved in acting ethically, move on from there to look at the obstacles to moral behavior, and then see the application of these obstacles to the case studies for this week. There are 4 basic steps towards moral behavior. The first is to recognize that a situation is ethical. Many of the situations in life that we encounter don't have any particularly strong moral implications. Recognizing, wait, this is a situation in which I might have to make a moral choice, is the first step towards moral behavior. The second is actually making a correct moral judgment. Once I recognize that this is a situation with moral ramifications, I have to make a correct moral judgment about what the right thing to do actually is. Then, once I figure out what the right thing to do is, I have to actually decide to do it. It might be the case that I stop at the second stage. Well, this would be the right thing to do, but I'm not going to do it. The third step towards the moral behavior, then, is actually deciding to carry out the moral action. And then finally, once I've decided to do what is right, I do actually have to carry it out. So I have to recognize the situation as ethical, make a correct moral judgment, decide to do that right thing, and then I have to go through the steps necessary to actually carry out my moral decision. There are specific impediments to moral behavior that occur at each of these 4 steps. One impediment upon which I might stumble in recognizing that a situation even has ethical ramifications is euphemistic labeling. If there's a safety issue, let's say, for my customers, I might say, well, this isn't really a safety issue, this is just common sense. If I label this as a situation in which the customer has to use common sense, well, then it sounds like there aren't any ethical ramifications to my decision whatsoever. So euphemistic labeling is a way for me to avoid thinking about the ethical ramifications of my choices. The second thing that is sometimes an impediment to me is rationalizing my actions. So for instance, I might tell myself, I'm just doing this because I'm running out of time, or I'm doing this because other people are doing it, or I'm doing it because bonus time is coming up and I need the extra money. And so if we put it in the terms, if we rationalize our actions as something pragmatic, for instance, then we might not see the situation as having ethical import. The other is diminishing comparisons. Yes, I am about to do this thing, but people do things that are a lot worse. Yes, I'm going to take some money out of petty cash, but there are people who rob millions of dollars from corporations. So we try to avoid even thinking about the situation as ethical by using diminishing comparisons. The other thing is displacement of responsibility. I might say, you know what, this is not my area of responsibility, so it's not an ethical situation at all. Yes, I see that the harassment's going on, but that's not my department. I'm in repair, and that's in marketing. Displacement of responsibility can cause me to look the other way and say, this is not a situation in which I have an ethical decision to make. Diffusion of responsibility is another impediment, and this has been a problem, for instance, with regards to 911 calls. People driving down a highway might see somebody in trouble and they assume, well, someone else is going to take care of this. So they diffuse responsibility among the hundreds of people passing by. As it turns out, in some cases, everybody does that. So the responsibility is completely diffused. No one sees it as an ethical obligation that they in particular might have. The other thing we might do is disregard the harm or distort the harm in some way. Say this is not really going to impact people the way I might imagine. And finally, we might dehumanize the victim. So we might think, well, this is our enemy, so I'm not concerned about what's going to happen to them. Or this is somebody who, if they make this mistake, they deserve to be injured in this way, or they deserve to suffer this loss. We dehumanize the victim. And part of this also can be redirecting blame. We redirect blame towards others and say, well, if I act in a certain way, or if I fail to prevent this, the blame doesn't fall on me, it would fall on someone else. So these are 8 obstacles that we might encounter that might keep us from even recognizing, wow, this is an ethical situation. This is not a run-of-the-mill situation where I'm just doing these tasks. There is something important here in regards to human value, and I have a choice to make. Any of these 8 sorts of impediments can come up and keep me from seeing the situation as being as important as it is in terms of ethics and human value. When I'm actually judging what the ethical action in this situation is, I encounter more obstacles. The first involve biased theories that I might have about the world. And there are so many ways in which humans are biased in their thinking. For instance, we limit the information that we consider by ignoring low probability consequences. Sometimes we wrongly assess the relative risks involved, or we fail to recognize all of the stakeholders who will be impacted by our decision. Sometimes we ignore the possibility that the public will find out what we did, or we discount consequences if they're very far in the future. Finally, sometimes we can fail to take into account the indirect effects of our actions, and we're biased towards merely the direct impact of our actions. Sometimes we also have biased theories about others. So, in particular, we might make decisions that are based on stereotypes. We might have stereotypes about the other people involved in the situation, or about companies or governmental organizations. Sometimes we'll have biased theories in terms of ethnocentrism or patriotism or nationalism. And these can all influence our judgments about what the right thing to do is in a given circumstance. Finally, we all have very common biases about ourselves. For instance, we tend to think of ourselves as being more capable, insightful, courteous, ethical, and fair than other people. Or we might think that we deserve rewards or bonuses or pay increases more than other people. Sometimes we overestimate the likelihood that we'll experience good events, or we underestimate the likelihood that we might experience bad events. In many ways, we think wrongly about ourselves. This is unfortunately just natural to us, and this is another thing that can keep us from having a correct judgment about what an ethical action is. Even if we've recognized that a situation is one with ethical import, and we've thought through what the right thing to do is, we might not go any further. We might not make a decision to do that right thing. Some impediments to making that decision to do the right thing include the ethical culture of the organization. So, for instance, an organization might be put together in a certain way so that ethics is completely ignored. There might be such a focus on the bottom line that the idea of doing something ethical is not even encouraged. In fact, in a corporation like this, you might be punished for doing the ethical thing. A positive ethical culture will be one in which a company gives incentives for ethical action. It gives examples of appropriate behavior and encourages us to emulate that behavior. And it gives us clear rules and policies about ethical action. In a culture like this, if I've gone through the first 2 steps, it will be relatively easy for me to decide to do what is right. If I'm in an unethical organization, then the entire environment surrounding me will discourage me from taking that action to do the right thing. Another impediment to moral decision making is moral seduction. And we'll see this in the B.F. Goodrich case. We might find ourselves doing something we never thought we would do. And if we ask the question, how did I get here? How did I end up making this horrible decision? And we look backwards, we'll see that we made a number of tiny steps in that direction. Moral seduction happens when we say, well, I would never do X, but I'll just do this little thing. And then once we do that little thing, we say, well, I've already done this little thing. It won't hurt if I do just this little additional thing. And so moral seduction is a lot of small steps in a direction that eventually lead us to a decision that we abhor and that we're shocked by. And that is an important impediment to doing the right thing. We say, well, I'm not going to totally do the wrong thing. I'll just do this small part of the wrong thing. And before we know it, we've completely disregarded our own and the company's moral values. Once we have recognized that a decision is ethical, and we've determined what the ethical course of action to do is, and we've decided to take the ethical action, then we come to the final step, where we actually have to carry out our decision. This is where the concept of weakness of will is so important. Our will, just like our bodies, is the sort of thing that has to be strengthened by repetition and practice. This is something we'll discuss next week when we look at Aristotle's theory of ethics. Weakness of will comes from not making the moral decisions in our lives on a regular enough basis. If you have a strong will, then once you've decided to carry out a decision, you almost always will. A weakness of will is a kind of weakness of character that stops us from carrying out the right decision once we've determined what it is. Another impediment to moral behavior at this stage are wrong beliefs about the locus of control. If we believe that we actually control the situation, that we can actually make this decision, that it's not outside of our control, then we'll tend to carry out the decision that we have made. If, however, we feel powerless, then we might, even at this late stage of the game, not carry out the decision that we've so carefully considered and determined to make. Another thing that might keep us from carrying out our decision is if we have such a strong willingness to obey authority figures that we can't take an action against their will. By the way, this is something that's often encouraged in certain corporate cultures, that you should always obey those in authority. There needs to be an opportunity for us to disobey authority and a willingness to disobey authority in order for us to carry out ethical decisions. There's also, just like we had in middle school, the issue of peer pressure. Again, this is related to corporate culture. If you're surrounded by people who are not committed to ethical acting, when you try to carry out your decision, you can be discouraged and blocked at every turn. Finally, we have fears of personal costs, and we talked about this as a mitigating factor for moral responsibility. Sometimes our moral responsibility is lessened somewhat by the high personal cost of acting. However, we also mentioned that the severity of the wrong can cancel out that consideration. If there's an issue of safety, and we can only save someone's life or save people from great suffering by carrying out an ethical decision in the workplace, it doesn't matter if we might have to absorb a personal cost. Ethics dictates that we make that decision. But it's the fear of personal costs at this stage that might really keep us from carrying out a really admirable and important decision. It is important to keep in mind these steps towards moral behavior and the impediments that we can encounter at each stage when looking at all of the case studies that we'll discuss this semester. This is especially true of the case studies that we're looking at this week. In the B.F. Goodrich case, we end up with a number of employees who make decisions that they probably could never have imagined they would make if we had told them ahead of time how things would unfold. And in the Health South case, we have real issues of fraud and corruption, and you can see the processes of moral seduction and diffusement of responsibility and many of the other obstacles to moral behavior at work. So I encourage you to have a list of these obstacles to moral behavior in front of you while you read these case studies, and you'll find it really illuminating in terms of understanding how people could have ended up in the predicaments in which they find themselves.